So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Hope you're off to a great start with the day or ending it on a good note with this webinar. So, my name is Abdulrahman Al Gindi, or Abdul for short, Head of Sales at Virtonomy, and I would like to welcome everyone and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. As many of you know, bringing a medical device to the market is already a complex and demanding journey. When it comes to pediatrics device, the challenges multiply. Small patient populations, ethical limits on clinical trials, and the shortcomings of bench and animal testing make innovation extremely challenging. That's where things are starting to change. Advances in computational modeling and simulation technologies, combined with the support from the regulatory bodies, are opening up new opportunities. And that brings us to today's session. Before we begin, and just a quick note, if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to share them in the Q&A tab, and we will make sure to answer and address them in this session. And with no further ado, I hand over to Kristen Debos, our Chief Commercial Officer, who will be moderating this session. Over to you, Kristen.
Thanks, Abdul, and welcome everybody to our webinar. Nice to see you all there. Yeah, we try to spread it out so Europe and US can dial in at decent times. Sorry for Asia Pacific, but we will have a recording available later. Quickly about the agenda. So we're going to have Emma Moran from CobiCure present about the clinical and market need for pediatric innovation first. It's a great starting point to set the tone on the conversation. We saw the slides. We were excited already ourselves. And followed by Simon, our CEO, Simon Sonntag, who will talk about more in-silico technologies in that space and how they're used in the cardiovascular implant space mostly. And that was then followed by a brief overview by Pras from the FDA, Pras Parasmanathan, on the work he did on in-silico in the recent years. And then we lead into a panel discussion with several questions that we have prepared for the panel to have a lively discussion and conversation going. And then hopefully we have enough time to get to at least a handful of Q&As that you can submit. We already have quite a few questions coming in, so we might also pick some of those depending on time that we have. Before we get to that, I'd like to have everybody introduce themselves quickly. Already kind of Abdul introduced me. I'm from Virtonomy for a year and a half now. Worked at CDW Siemens before that in business development for medical devices and simulation, and then led a team at Thornton Tomasetti that was mostly working on medical device simulation, cardiovascular implants mostly, and in-silico as well. So I've been with Virtonomy for a year and a half. Maybe let's give it to Emma. Quick introduction.
Hi, everyone. Emma Moran, you'll hear from me in a second. I'm the head of CobiCure MedTech.
Pras?
Hi, everyone. Pras Parasmanathan. I'm in the Office of Science and Engineering Labs in FDA's Center for Devices. I've done a lot of work in advancing computational modeling and simulation for device applications.
Let's go Parker then, maybe.
Yeah, hi, Parker Tyler, Director of Clinical Development for Edwards Lifesciences. Super excited to be here. I'm very passionate about in-silico clinical trials. I think it's going to completely transform our industry, and especially in the pediatric space, it's just going to get us the capability to get technology to patients much faster. So yeah, excited to be here.
Great. Tina?
Hi, Tina Morrison. My capacity here, I'm supporting Virtonomy with scientific advising. Really thrilled to be here. Former FDA, almost 17 years trying to work alongside folks like Pras to advance computational modeling and in-silico evidence for FDA-regulated products. So really excited to be here.
Thank you. And then last but not least, Simon.
Yeah, great being here. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. I'm Simon, CEO and co-founder of Virtonomy, now more than 15 years in the CMNS domain in the medical device industry, and great to see the advancements in this, and great to have everyone here from the discussion point and to talk about the latest progress.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. And well, let's get going. Emma, you want to share your slides and jump right into it?
All right. Looks good. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining here today. I'll be kicking things off with an overview of really the current state of pediatric device innovation, and in my case for why I think in-silico modeling can play a major role in advancing this area. As background, I'm an engineer by training, experience in the medical device industry, and now the head of CobiCure, which is a nonprofit that was founded to accelerate the development of pediatric devices and therapeutics for children. I head up CobiCure MedTech, and we also have a division focused on therapeutics. So first, what is a pediatric medical device? So FDA defines pediatric population from birth up until your 22nd birthday. And so keep in mind that 18 to 21-year-old age range is going to be important in some subsequent conversations. But and FDA has put out a couple of guidances around pediatric medical devices and their use. The guidance on the left there is pertinent to high-risk therapeutic devices, typically class 3, that go through the pre-market approval process, or PMAs, or humanitarian device exemption, HDEs. As you can see here, this guidance says include readily available information about pediatric subpopulations that suffer from a disease or condition that the device is intended to treat, cure, or diagnose. But keep in mind that these are non-binding recommendations, and to my knowledge, there are no requirements to include age or pediatric status in device labeling. And this also gets even more ambiguous with class 2 devices or things that go through the 510(k) process. Overall, pediatric device innovation significantly lags behind adults. So the data I'll share on these slides are from FDA reports to Congress. This is the latest one, analyzed 2021 and prior. It usually takes a couple of years to come out. And what do these data show us? So first, that when you look at overall rate of PMA and HDEs, it's increasing over time. But if you analyze the trend lines between the red bar here, which is adult, versus the blue bar, which is pediatrics, adult approvals are growing 2 times faster than pediatrics, meaning that this innovation gap is just widening over time. Second, when you look at overall, you look at the different subpopulations. Overall, 26% of PMAs, HDs include pediatrics, but breaking that down, only 12%. So the minority of those are actually for 18 years and under. Most of them fall into that 18 to 21-year-old age bucket. And then the percentage, so that 26 plus or minus a couple percentage split, has really remained stagnant over time. So despite the awareness of this problem, this innovation gap by the FDA and others in the ecosystem, we are not making measurable progress to close this gap, especially when it comes to high-risk therapeutic devices. So next, clinical studies. Overall, the clinical studies evaluating the safety and efficacy of pediatric medical devices are insufficient. There's 2 publications I put here from Florence Bourgeois and Juan Espinosa's groups. And these analyses showed that one of the 35%, only 35% of the clinical studies resulting in a pediatric label that we saw on the previous slide actually included pediatric patients. And a lot of those are that 18 and over bucket. Compared to studies with pediatrics and adults, pediatric-only studies had less patients, fewer class 3 devices, less likely to be funded by industry, and more likely to be single center. And when we're talking about less patients, these analyses found that 52% of pediatric clinical studies completed in these analyses enrolled fewer than 50 patients. So from a clinical affairs perspective, pediatric clinical trials are hard to design, recruit, execute, and statistically power in order to gain meaningful data on device safety and efficacy. The result of all this is that off-label use of medical devices on children is common. So the first publication I'm aware of and this came from 2010, analyzing pediatric interventional cardiology in the US and found that off-label use occurred in 63% of patients. In 2016, the American Academy of Pediatrics, or AAP, put out a position statement on the off-label use, stating that there's a gap, and because of this gap, it necessitates the use of off-label medical devices. And have we closed that gap? I would argue no. A publication came out this year looking at heart valves and their use in pediatric patients from 2016 to 2022, and found that less than 10% of the implanted devices were approved for pediatric patients in those indications. Off-label use of medical devices in children is a health inequity. It's common out of necessity, but the result of that means that there's a lack of a thorough understanding of the risk-benefit profile in these patients, little to no safety data, insufficient education, training, and clinical support for healthcare providers, insufficient materials for patients and their families, and financial reimbursement, while it does occur, can be ad hoc and challenging in a lot of instances. So how did we get here? What are the challenges? And I believe that the challenges really occur at all stages of the device development and commercialization timeline. So I'm sure folks here have seen kind of this graphic in various iterations. You start with your clinical need, you bring it all the way through R&D, clinical trials, regulatory approval, and then commercialization. Starting at the very beginning, from a clinical needs standpoint, there's differences in disease states, there's a smaller number of patients, heterogeneous disease states, patient may not be able to communicate, parental involvement, and the lack of devices drives different approaches to patient care. You start to ideate your solution, come up with the device design. There are very unique design considerations, a need for device longevity for much longer for kids than adult patients. Somatic growth, especially with implantable devices, is a huge design component consideration. There's differing anatomy and physiology, and the cognitive capacity of the user is different. You start getting into the R&D process. There's few or insufficient test standards and guidelines for these patient populations, and challenging, insufficient, or frankly, in existence animal models in many cases to study things like the impact of growth on an implant or unique anatomical or physiological states that can sometimes occur in some of these patient populations. I already touched a little bit on clinical trials. Small patient numbers affects recruitment, site recruitment. The heterogeneous patient population is really challenging from a study design and execution standpoint. Randomized controlled trials are challenging or oftentimes impossible to power and recruit. And then things like additional consent and assent consideration in pediatrics is also something to consider. Then getting on to the commercialization side, small volume manufacturing, there's a unique customer base at children's hospitals. There's lower reimbursement in the Medicaid system, and it also varies state by state. It's highly complex. And these small markets make sustaining continuous improvement on devices challenging. However, I am under the firm belief that these are not insurmountable challenges, and given the proper financial resources, especially, they can be overcome. The challenging is that medical device development is extremely costly. This is an analysis from HHS back in 2022 that they published that found the mean cost of developing a novel therapeutic device in the United States is $54 million, and this does not include any post-market approval studies. If you include the cost of capital and risk and so on associated with device development, that number is $522 million per device. And unfortunately, many of the pediatric markets that these devices are serving just aren't big enough to justify this investment from an industry side, but also just overall investment landscape for medical device innovation in the US and globally. And that's where I think in-silico modeling can play a huge role by reducing costs, accelerating timelines, while overall de-risking development from a safety and efficacy standpoint to ensure that we can get safer, more effective devices for kids. And I think in-silico modeling can have a significant impact across this this development pipeline. At the early stage, by increasing the rate of learning, decrease the cost of learning, decrease the risk of unknowns. I borrowed these images from our panelist Parker here, taking things from the physical design world to the virtual design cycle. We'll talk about the impact in clinical trials by reducing trial uncertainty, size, and complexity, and overall enrollment and monitoring, and then ultimately resulting in increased confidence in the technology that we're delivering to the patients, safer, more effective, increased patient access, and speed to treatment. So with that, thank you very much. I was excited to be here today and to team up with Virtonomy and the other experts on the call. I'll hand it off to you all.
Thank you, Emma. That was a great introduction, as I already knew. And we'll pass it right on to Simon to talk a bit more of technical aspects and technologies available today. We'll grab that, Simon.
Yes. So many thanks, Emma, for the introduction to settle the tone, why change is needed. And I now want to continue where we ended with the In-Silico part of this. First of all, for everyone who's maybe not so familiar with the term In-Silico, where this is coming from, so I guess everyone is familiar with the conventional way of medical device testing safety and effectiveness, like in vitro, benchtop testing, in vivo, in animal, and then also in the human testing. And now In-Silico is the fourth type of model that is really coming from the computer. So computational modeling and simulation with that. And how does this work? So at Virtonomy, we have created our own solution and workflow for this. The basis is real clinical data, so coming from patients, like imaging data, but also additional data from that. We have created here a big database of thousands of imaging data, also in the pediatric domain. And I will show this later on a bit more in the examples that I give, then how this also looks then like from this side. With this imaging data, we can reconstruct then so-called virtual patients. With that, all kinds of different analyses can be done, like statistical analysis, population studies, and then can be combined with multi-physics simulations. And then really the implant deployment, but also all kinds of different effects of the implant on structure mechanics, on fluid dynamics, hemocompatibility, and so on, can be investigated then using the simulation environment. Here, now a short video, how this is done with our software solution. So the user can define their target cohort, like for example, mitral valve insufficiency, then also if there is any specifics more for male, female, the origin of the patient group, and then also the elderly group. So for example, pediatrics can be defined here. Then you can model your simulation. You can put in your simulation framework, so your device, and then run the simulation in our environment, investigate then also the outcome, how this works. Like in this case, like the fitting of a catheter, including then also vessel straightening of this. So how the device then really fits into the patient population there, and then also with all kinds of different parameters associated with this. Now, how does it work? And I take here also what Emma already presented, give a bit more into the details. So we see here the different stages of the product development of a medical device. And what Emma already said, later you fail in such a clinical trial, and the process, the more expensive it gets, and the more risky it gets also for the patient, the population, and a lot of unknowns that is associated with this. So the benefit of the simulation is that already early on, even before prototyping, before decision, sort of the design freeze, you can include the simulation framework. So virtual patients in simulation to optimize the design of the device, but also to test all kinds of different environments. So the loops of design iterations are way less expensive than when you do this in a later stage of this. But also during animal testing and also benchtop testing, this can be incorporated into the process, and then finally into the clinical trial by using like a hybrid clinical trial where part of this is simulated and part of it is done into the real human clinical trial. The benefits out of this is faster time to market, more efficient in the whole process, but especially also to gain confidence before you start with the clinical trial, and to also have more diversity in this. And this is a big problem in the pediatric domain, because diversity, variability, what we have just seen, is very, very difficult then to incorporate in a real world clinical trial. Recruitment is so difficult there, and also the patient group is just too small in this. At Virtonomy, we are focusing on the cardiovascular domain in different areas, for example, structural heart with heart valve replacement, repair, stents, but also enclosure devices, heart support devices like pacemaker assist devices, artificial heart, and also vascular devices like cannulas, catheters, and other areas of this. Now getting more to the pediatric domain, we have here gathered a good database of patients in different age groups from zero age until 18 years old. We have also data of real newborns, so only a couple of days old, but also patients then on elderly stage. Most of the data is coming from patients from 0 to 8 years. We also have like full body scans where you then also can investigate the access route, for example, and also specific data like patients where no pulmonary valve is included. This is also very important for specific devices that need to be then also investigating this target cohort. Now, how can this be integrated in the process? We have this in 3 different stages. First, design engineering. Here, the issue really is that there's very unique anatomy of these patients, what then results in very unique design considerations and very difficult requirements for design. So the simulation can here help to objectivize this, to have a better consideration of parameters when you do the design decision, the design freeze, and also it allows for better design optimization and reduce the risks of unknowns that is very prominent in the pediatric device development. One example here is pediatric heart assist devices. We cannot show the device itself, but you can see that here it was really investigated how the device fits into a group of patients with all kinds of different parameters of the surrounding tissue, like also papillary muscle, the fitting of this, with all this then incorporated into the design process. With that, all kinds of statistics can be incorporated. So you can have a look in all kinds of different parameters, curvatures, torsion, tortuosity, to also have a worst case assessment then of the measurements and also the anatomies. We can cluster this into male, female, for example, and also all kinds of different parameters to see how's the distribution among the patient group, to see what is the 50th percentile of patients, 75th, 95th percentile, to really understand what is then also the confined space of the patient and patient group in this. With that, you can then investigate different designs of your device to see what is better, design 1 or 2, you don't know. Also, what does it mean better in what regard? So we can combine this here with the anatomical variability. We are using our in-house statistical shape models for this. We can create like standard average models, but also variances out of this. And then combine this with the simulation to have a parameter study to see what is the best design of this, but also maybe very critical areas where maybe the device does not work in what population group, because this is also essential to know once you then get to the next stage of the clinical trial, of really then the planning of this. And this is then really the next stage, because here in the pediatric domain, there's so much variability and there's so limited clinical data available and very often difficult to recruit patients that you really need to plan this very well in advance in that. And also then to substitute part of the clinical trial using the In-Silico part of this to reduce then the real world sample size of that. And here one example is in the pediatric ECMO area, so lung support domain here, where the access route was especially of interest. So coming from the jugular vein, from the right internal jugular vein, then to the right atrium, it's very different from patient to patient because the length is very much variability in this. And this also defines then also who to target with in the clinical trial, what device type, size, positioning, and so on. So this can be used here really then to plan the clinical trial, to have a proper target cohort, to then have also a proper protocol of this. And finally, then once you advance further to the clinical trial, it can also be used to support the clinical trial decision support itself, because there's so much risk associated with this, so many unknowns in this, and still also the variability of that. So then In-Silico can really help to reduce the risk of any adverse events happening there, to improve the outcome of this and support with that. And one example I want to show is from Berlin Heart, because this is a blood pump support of real pediatric patients, of really young patients. And it's very difficult because of the small chest size to implant the device, to have the cannulas then positioned correctly, the sizes of this. So this can have an additional challenge for the clinician for the implantation of this. So simulation can help to better define this in advance, so even before you do the implantation of this, to have a better understanding of the space, of the conditions, of the vascular access. And this can be really used to display this in a way that was not possible before. The outcome and feedback that we got is really phenomenal on using this. So I hope I showed you a bit why not use virtual patients and simulation in pediatric patients. So why should we not use this if this is possible? Because it's a small and underpowered studies. There's really small patient size. There's so much of a variability in this, what makes it so difficult. There's very high cost associated with this. What Emma said, this means that not many companies are working on this. And there's also all the ethical constraints associated with this. There's all the risks in that. So we're looking forward then to the panel discussion to go in more detail. Just on a side note, if you're at TCT in San Francisco soon, you can visit us also at our booth.
Great. Thank you, Simon. Yeah, looking forward to see you at TCT in my hometown. So, with that, I want to ask Pras just to give us a little bit of overview, insight into his work at the CDRH before we start the panel. I think that we're all on the same page then. Pras, Simon's going to advance the slides for you.
Okay, thanks, Christian. Simon, we can go straight to the next slide. Okay, just kind of expanding upon my intro before. My name is Pras Manthan. I'm a scientist in the Office of Engineering Labs at FDA. I'm a mathematician by training, not an engineer like most of the people in CDRH. Did a lot of work in the cardiac modeling space, and I came to FDA initially on that space, but very quickly learned that FDA was very interested in advancing modeling and simulation in general and started working in that area. Next slide, please. This is a timeline of some of the things that have happened in the last decade or so. I would say that prior to all this, CDRH was receiving simulation in submissions in a few kind of niche areas. And then in the early 2010s, there was a realization that we needed to be developing standards and guidances to standardize how we review submissions. And that led to three important documents. First, the simulation study reporting guidance in 2016, then the V&V 40 standard in 2018, which was a big milestone for the medical devices community. It's the first standard that was focused on how do we evaluate computational modeling and simulation for medical device applications. And then we supported that with a guidance on the same topic that was released in public final form in 2023. At the same time, OCEL, that's my regulatory science office, has been developing what we call regulatory science tools. And these are tools that industry can use to support the development and submission of their devices. And some of those are in the modeling space. Next slide, please. It's a bit challenging to know exactly how many submissions use modeling and simulation, but we can estimate it by looking at how many submissions cited either the two guidances. The reporting guidance that I mentioned came out in 2016, though it came out in draft form in 2014, or the credibility guidance that came out in draft 2021, final in 2023. And this figure on the left-hand side shows how the number of submissions that cite either of those standards is increasing over the years. It's probably an underestimate, or it's definitely an underestimate of how much simulation is used, because not everyone will be using the guidances, and maybe there'll be a few citations that were missed. But it shows how it's growing, shows how the credibility guidance has made a difference. The subfigure on the right-hand side compares the types of submissions these are used on, and two things to note for the reporting guidance: the simulation study reporting guidance that's mostly in the 510K space for applications that are pretty well established. For the credibility guidance, it's a lot in the Q submission space. So that's essentially companies starting to ask FDA, how could we be using modeling in these more novel areas? Next slide, please. So some examples of how we are seeing modeling in submissions. This slide is a kind of snapshot of areas where we have seen significant modeling and simulation in submissions, and it's broken down by different OHTs. That's Office of Health Technologies within the review office within FDA. So across multiple OHTs, FDA, CDRH reviews simulation related to MR-induced heating of passive implants, thermal safety of batteries or pulse generators or thermal devices, and acoustic devices. Cardiovascular office receives simulation in a variety of different applications. Fracture risk is a big one. That's also true of the orthopedic office, OHT. Then there's things like hemolysis risk, MR-induced heating of active implants, which is slightly more challenging than MR-induced heating of passive implants. Things like fractional flow reserve, software as a medical device. So there's different ways the model can be used in submissions. It can be used to demonstrate safety or effectiveness of a physical device, or it could be used in device software. Also an important area, which is mentioned in the OHT1 and OHT7 things here, is closed loop control devices. So these are often tested on patient models. Next slide, please. So if you're interested in learning more about these things, especially the guidance or RSTs, you can go to the RST website, just Google FDA RST. If you want to know more about the guidance, we did release a webinar. We did a webinar, it's publicly available on CDRH Learn. I'm also actually presenting in about an hour and a half for a MathWorks webinar, if you're interested in hearing more about those two topics. And finally, I'm co-chairing the MDIC Symposium on Modeling and Simulation that's being held in the DC area in November. So that's another something to come to if you're interested. All right, I'll pass it back to you, Christian.
Thank you, Pras, and thanks, Emma and Simon as well. So I think we're all on the same page now. We're all excited. So let's discuss some of these topic points. And for that, we've prepared a few questions. I might direct it to some of you, but then also just feel free and make us an open discussion where you have your 2 cents to contribute, or maybe full dollar. Put it in there. Just go for it. So one of the points that, of course, is in your face right away from Emma's presentation, quite clear. Pediatrics children are different from grown-ups. So one question was, what are some unique anatomical and physiological consideration in pediatric patients that you believe might still be underrepresented or poorly captured in In-Silico, where we need to, or where In-Silico can really help to capture that? How about Parker? You've been all quiet because it didn't give you any slides.
Yeah, for sure. But I think obviously we know that not only you have increased variation, but you have decrease in sample size. So it's really hard, I think, to capture that even, in real life in the physical world. It seems impossible. So I think we have to lean into the digital world when it comes to that. Specifics, I'm not too familiar with exact specifics of the anatomical conditions, but I will say that I think digital is the tool that we have to use to actually be able to do this. Like, we cannot rely on the physical world to understand this.
Yeah, maybe Tina, do you have, from your previous FDA experience and your new world experience that you have now, how do you see it? Is this something we're missing, or?
So as I was thinking about this question, and I think it's an important one, because I think even in Emma's slide, she touched on the anatomical considerations. And one of the things I had the honor to do working in the Office of Cardiovascular Devices, when it was still the Office of Device Evaluation years ago, was looking at and investigating the physiological use conditions. So I think one of the areas that to extend using In-Silico approaches is that the devices that are used for adult indications often have very rigorous testing requirements, right? There's some both for durability testing of pulsatile activity, radial bending, axial, depending on, of course, the anatomical location of the implant. I think it's really interesting to take into consideration, other things we look at are like resting conditions versus activity conditions. What does that look like for a pediatric patient? Not just the anatomical constraints, but also the variation in the physiological representation of the devices implanted in those likely smaller, even probably more tortuous vessels. So that's a great place to do that full suite of testing, both of anatomical considerations, but the different physiological conditions, and say, can we even be safely using these implants in children who may have some particular activity level or physiological conditions that would be different than adults. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to explore that in addition to the anatomical sizing.
Yeah, good points there. Emma, I think you're the most experienced. No, I don't think so. I know. Is there some implications from these restrictions that if we don't look at everything, that how these devices can be used or are used today?
In terms, can you kind of rephrase that maybe?
Yeah, so if we don't understand how these devices can be used and how these differences really come into play, and then they would basically take a device for an adult and then use it for a child.
Yeah.
What are the implications? How can that really be a bad decision or a good decision, or mostly bad, I think?
Yeah. I mean, the current state is that, the physician uses what they believe is the best thing to care for that patient, knowing that the risk is very different than if that was developed, designed, approved, and utilized for an adult patient with all these rigorous testing standards in place. And so I think at the end of the day, it means that the devices being used just have a uncertain risk benefit profile at the end of the day. And the only way to collect that data is to utilize it more and more and, maybe look at it in a registry or things like that. But it's all being done retrospectively after, clinical use over many, many years. So I think that's where In-Silico modeling, if you can flip that and do a lot of this testing in silico beforehand, or even in parallel with the clinical use, it's only value add to ultimately the care that's being delivered to those patients and hopefully the safety as well.
Yep. Well, let's go to the next one, but again, jump in if you have something to add to it. So another question was kind of really connected to this one is, how does In-Silico, how can we really include the fact that children are growing over time, right? So that's something we don't see in adults too much. Yes, we have the pathologies changing and things like that. We're aging, something I'm experiencing every morning getting up. But for child, it's the other way around. They're growing, the tissue properties are changing. So maybe a question for Pras here or for Tina. Maybe let's start with Pras. Would regulators expect models that account for that projected growth curve? How do you see that from your perspective at the FDA?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and I'll start by providing maybe a bit of context about the use of modeling for pediatric questions of interest in Reg 3 submissions. So I'm not too familiar with that many submissions that have very clearly used modeling to support a pediatric device or pediatric indications. And I did a kind of straw poll of a few contacts, and similarly, the others at FDA who are very involved in modeling and simulation have not received so many. So there's definitely opportunities here, I think. There's a gap, and there's opportunities for the community as a whole to start to develop guidance, best practice standards. And this is one of the questions that will need to be addressed. And well, it's, when we do simulate stent fracture, for example, we don't stimulate the full lifetime of the stent in a patient. The way it's typically done is you do simulations to predict where stresses will be the greatest, and then use that to identify worst case designs, and then do bench testing on those. And so you could have something similar like that, but yes, when you do those simulations, it might be necessary to provide loading conditions that capture different stages of the child's growth. So the answer is maybe. The answer to all of these questions from a regulatory perspective will always be maybe, it depends. We always recommend that industry interact early with the agency through the Q submission process to discuss. But yeah, like going back to my earlier point, I think it's something for the community to start to discuss and ideally come up with standards and best practices.
Yeah, thank you, Pras. I mean, reminds me of our times at the VNV40 work where it's like you got to go to the FDA and have this conversation early. And that was really encouraging to see how those Q subs were really going up in your slide there. Maybe Simon, you can comment there too. As I know I don't want to answer for us, but there's some work that we have been seeing that a device that grows with the child was considered. So maybe you can just comment on the technical capabilities that are available today.
Yeah, there are technical capabilities where you can include like multi-scale growth models or mechanobiological models into this to really see then also the advancement of tissue, but also anatomy. With anatomy, it's one aspect that is challenging, that very often you don't have like data on the patient on different ages, because imaging is not done like consistently over time. Also, we don't want to do this with the children, of course, having continuously imaging then of them. So there's a lack of data definitely on the growth side. And you cannot just scale the anatomy and make it larger and then have like an older group. So it's really important then to have like a good amount of data of patients in different age groups when you really want to consider then also this part, but also remodeling effects and so on. This is something that is addressed, I would say, early, more in research areas, but not really fully into this part on that. So there's still room for improvements and advancements on the technology side. There are parts that can already be addressed, especially when it comes to more statistical areas and then multi-scale growth modeling in this, but definitely something that is happening also the next years on the technical side.
Good.
If I could extend and even bridge this question with the previous one where Emma was talking about, the benefit risk. I think depending on the location and the type of the implant, the material of the implant, what's happening locally with biology, endothelialization, like how much would we actually expect, the growth of a vessel locally to happen in a child with respect to the endothelialization, say, of a stent implanted in a vessel, or for example, in a coarc. So I think you have to take into consideration, your question was, would FDA expect it? I think it depends on the location of the device, the type of the device, the implant, whether the implant would even give and grow with the vessel or it would restrict the vessel. What would be considerations for that? Are there secondary treatments, for example, later on adding another device, kind of like they do with heart valve scenarios? So I think you probably, as an industry sponsor, would want to come up with a list of all these different questions and kind of decide whether you actually think a growth and remodeling capability is really necessary for those considerations. In some cases there would be, but across the board, I wouldn't say yes necessarily.
Yeah, so Parker, since we have somebody from the industry, how are you doing that today? Consider those things.
I mean, lifetime management is obviously huge, and then the younger you get, the more important it becomes, and the more you have to consider. But yeah, I mean, it's tricky. I mean, you think about how we do it in the physical world today and how we learn, it's not ideal, right? And so I think augmenting that with the digital capability is huge. And it's not going to be perfect by any means, but I think it goes back to, if you can learn something and it can give you insight into device performance, then it's huge. It's a win, right? Regardless on if it's going to tell you every possible consideration, right? And I think that's really important when we talk about In-Silico, is that like the why to me, and I think the why a lot of people need to focus on, is that it increases your ability to learn more than what we have today. And if you focus on that as like your motivation, then you can start to really ask the right questions and create the right strategy to then be able to be like, okay, we can see when this might become a problem at a certain age or performance. Maybe we don't need to model it every single 6 months or whatever, right? But we can create the right understanding of when this is going to be a risky situation and when we might need to make a design change or create some sort of indication, whatever it is, right? So, yeah, it's important.
Yep. Yeah, time flies. So I want to jump to the next question, and we still want to get to some Q&A. So one question we had was, as we're building the digital twins today, we also want to look at the most immediate clinical value. So it could be device sizing or surgical planning or long-term surveillance that we were talking about, right? So maybe I could go right back to you, Parker. From an R&D lens, which of these applications for you would create the clearest ROI or clinical impact?
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
I mean, it all comes down to risk, right? And your ability to learn and this risk to benefit ratio. I think they're all important. And it depends where you are in the life cycle of the product and the life cycle of the development, where your ROI is going to be, right? So you want to learn fast and you want to fail fast with the least amount of risk. So your device design, obviously, that's going to have a ton of ROI in early phases when you're in concept selection. So you can find the most robust design early. And then as you move through the cycle, you're going to start moving into like device planning, et cetera, or procedure planning. But I think you really, with anything digital, it's really easy to get overwhelmed with all the applications, and you can really dilute your resources fast. And that's where you have to be super focused on that ROI question on how can you learn the most, the fastest. And it's going to be different in every situation and for every company and everyone who's doing this. So if you can focus on that, like where does learning get me the most at this point, then I think your ROI will always be the highest. But that's really challenging because that isn't necessarily always the same question and where the business is aligned, right? And what the biggest question that the business wants, right? And so you have to manage that very carefully in your project and make sure you're putting your resources in the right places.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to business at the end of the day, right? And that's one of the issues with pediatrics and where In-Silico can really help. Maybe a variation of the same question to Emma still. Where do you see the biggest clinical need for, because you see a lot of applications coming across your desk, right? Maybe you can just dial us in where you see the biggest clinical need, type of device or application.
Yeah, I think the biggest gaps we know from a clinical need standpoint are class 3 devices for the youngest kids. And we're talking neonates, infants, like that is like by the data the biggest gaps in the marketplace. And the reason because that's the hardest to develop. That's where you're going to have the most, intense growth, the biggest longevity, probably the sickest patients if they're, getting surgery right after birth in terms of like complex anatomies and physiologies. But I think that's where, given the clinical needs, like the current model, no utilization of In-Silico in a significant way is failing those types of devices. And so if you purely look at it from like what type of projects would have the highest impact, it would be on developing those. And I think there's lots of opportunities both from the development standpoint on some of the growth and being able to kind of change the way we're currently developing devices and the economics associated with that, as well as the clinical trial standpoint to flip the script there. So yeah, that's the biggest area. But that being said, I think there's opportunity across all pediatric devices. They're all underserved, just to varying degrees.
Yeah. All equally underserved. That's unfortunately true. I do want to go to one more question just because I want to really know the answer. So for Pras and for Tina, more on the regulatory side. And then we go to Q&A. If we go in full hour, hopefully everybody's fine. So what types of clinical data, especially in the low volume pediatric populations, do you think are still, or do you know of, are still missing or hard to get? And then what do you think can simulation help to bridge that gap, also ethically? Maybe Tina first, then Praz, or vice versa?
This question aligns with a comment that I wanted to make in terms of like low hanging fruit activities that can help to even get certain adult devices on label for pediatrics, so that we can start collecting the necessary data to determine updates to labeling changes long term. So there's a project that's going on in the Division of Applied Mechanics, actually in OCEL, where the division director is working with sponsors across multiple device areas, looking in their submissions and saying, look, your device sizes actually could be put on label for these device sizes for pediatric patients. And I believe a handful of devices had updated labeling sizes specific for pediatric populations. Probably, Emma, not all the way down to the highest need as you articulated, but it's work like that that's very easy to get started, so that once these devices are on label, we can start tracking adverse events that might happen in the database. If these devices don't get on label, we can't do that important tracking that's needed. The agency can't do that important work. So I think that's one consideration I would add to this conversation. Of course, simulation could actually help investigate those smaller sizes under different conditions to get those devices on label.
Yeah. Praz, you want to comment on that too?
Yeah, so I don't know if I can really comment on the specifics of the question in terms of what types of data, but I will make a comment about the challenges related to lack of data. Parker mentioned it earlier. There's a lack of data for pediatrics, which leads to challenges with device design, development, and evaluation. And on one hand, those challenges transfer to computational modeling because you need that data to develop the models, validate the models. But at least with computational modeling, we do have a formal approach for dealing with uncertainty, and we can, if you can bound the uncertainties in some ways, you can do what we call uncertainty quantification and try to demonstrate that those uncertainties are understandable and the impact of the uncertainties are understandable. So there's a lot of power to computational modeling that can be used to address some of the challenges that we have.
Good. Before we get to Q&A, and we get quite a few coming in, I think we might go to 2 or 3 of them. Anybody else wants to comment on any of the conversation topics that we had that we might want to still elaborate on? Did we miss something that we still want to get out there? No. And we have a bunch more internal questions that we wanted to ask or that we decided on before, but let's go to the Q&A because we only have really a few minutes left. Terry asked a question about preborn. Is that considered pediatric? I don't think it's quite the same, but I would think In-Silico can apply. I think Emma is shaking her head, so I'll let you comment on that.
It's this weird gray zone. It's not considered pediatric medical device by the FDA definition of pediatrics because it starts at birth. But there are devices. There are devices used off-label and on-label, and a need for a lot of innovation in this space. And I certainly don't see why not. Why In-Silico modeling would add any different value proposition for this population compared to pediatrics or any others.
Good. Okay. Thank you. I'll do a couple more. Henry was asking, are In-Silico trials still theoretical at this point, or have there been any devices that have incorporated In-Silico trials in their approval process already? I think Praz already kind of answered that. But see, there was an add-on to that. Is there already a clear framework for how In-Silico trials are to be used in the bigger picture of obtaining device approval? For example, is there clear knowledge of what the reduction burden of enrolling patients in pivotal trial might be if an In-Silico were to be incorporated first? Yeah, maybe I give it to Tina and Praz. Maybe Praz, you want to comment on that?
Yeah. Okay, so I think one of the things, a term that we use sometimes is In-Silico clinical trial. We've released some publications in that space, and I distinguish between a a simulation study that might be of a device by itself or a device with some patient-based boundary conditions versus an in-silico clinical trial where it's a device coupled to a patient model, and then there's a cohort of patient models. So there's an n greater than 1 set of patient models. And I'm going to assume the question is referring to that. If it was referring to simulation studies in general, then yes, that slide that I mentioned earlier showed how modeling is used across a wide range of applications. For in-silico clinical trials, it's a new area. We have, like I mentioned, some publications. The community is trying to figure out best practice. But there are applications where even if it was not considered or named an in-silico clinical trial, FDA has been receiving submissions and approving devices based on simulation studies that are essentially an in-silico clinical trial. The MR heating application, for example, that uses a n greater than 1 number of patient models, or the physiological closed-loop control devices, which are evaluated for example, the stability of the algorithm on a set of patient models. So in that sense, yes, in-silico clinical trials have been used for in regulatory submissions successfully. And the second part of your question, not yet. The community is still talking about this and developing best practices and standards.
I have one more question for Parker, but I'd like to have Tina comment on process statement, maybe if you could.
I think that the hierarchical frameworks that Pras and the team published last year are a really good starting point for thinking about this. We have considered these types of work in terms of not just doing the actual studies, but the statistical pieces to enrich a trial. There was some work with MDIC. There are a couple publications that talked about some of the Bayesian statistical approach where you could actually bridge these together. I think outside of the imaging world, I don't think we have any real cases of these in-silico clinical trials yet, but it would be great if there are folks who are eager to take that into consideration and want support for thinking about how you approach a regulatory body with that. And also think broadly outside of FDA, other regulatory bodies like MHRA in the UK and EMA have very strong initiatives for innovation. And with the climate these days, there are other places where folks might want to entertain these types of discussions as well.
Very good point.
One thing I want... Yeah, no, please.
Sorry, just one more thing to point out. The importance of this growing, as I mentioned, regulatory bodies. There will be a topic was a topic at the recent International Medical Device Regulators Forum in Japan, which is a forum that brings together the regulatory bodies. Maybe there's 12 or 14 of them. And modeling and simulation was finally on the agenda. There's a work item specifically geared towards this topic. So again, just more evidence of the growing recognition by other regulatory bodies on this topic.
Yeah, that's great. And one thing that I wanted to add here from Europe, there's a new guidance by the Medical Device Coordination Group on the orphan medical devices. So orphan medical devices are ones who have a very small or niche market. What is very often true of pediatric devices. In this guidance document, it's explicitly mentioned that coordination modeling simulation is used or should be used in this because of all the issues that we just addressed also there. So it's really good that also these new standards and guidance are incorporating that, and we see this more and more happening now.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Simon. So I let Parker finish on the last question. And then what I also want to let everybody know that we wrote down all the questions that are coming in, about 20 questions or something. We'll get back to you individually and let you know. Parker, to wrap it up, how to practically start a project in this area? How will you go about that coming from the industry?
Yeah, for sure. So like I said before, like digital is super dangerous in that like I think a lot of digital projects in general fail because people get excited about all the applications and all the possible value and they sign up for too much. And so it's sort of like mountaineering. Like you want to get into mountaineering, like don't make Everest your first mountain, right? You want to start super easy and ease into it. So you need to find that like question of interest or that value that allows you to go fast, fail fast, and learn. And to do that, you need to do something that you ideally already have data on. You can get data pretty quickly, that that you can get talent pretty quickly, and that you can get software pretty quickly. Those are like the 3 ingredients that you need to be able to do this. So you have to match sort of that need or that question with what you kind of already have, and just focus on learning and being curious and failing, and that will build sort of that strength and that muscle and that framework. Then you can build up from there, and you can get more exciting, I would say. But yeah, definitely start small. Don't go big at first, would be my recommendation.
If I might tag in really quick, there's a link that Virtonomy can share of a document that was a white paper that was developed by industry for business decision makers about In-Silico. It has a ton of resources available. So if you've never started, that's a good place to also start.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I wrote that down. I got that link. So, and together with all the other questions, we can share that. And we will also make this recording available for everybody online to dial in later. And we're right at the hour, 1 minute over, perfect. Want to thank everybody for the panel discussion, everybody who dialed in for your attention and for dialing in, and all the interesting questions that still keep coming. If you don't have a chance anymore to put them in, just send them to me or to Abdul, and we'll get back to you later. Anybody else final words? Other than I would say thank you all, and it was a great topic, and more to come on it in the future. All right then.
Thank you for putting this on.
Thank
Great
you.
conversation.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Go on.
Bye.
Bye.